Thank you, Sean. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on this installment of our Venture in the Capital virtual series. I am super, super excited to have Shaun Maguire with us today. Sean is a partner at Sequoia Capital, where he invests in transformative technologies spanning defense, AI, enterprise infrastructure, and crypto. He's a Caltech trained physicist with a PhD in quantum computing, and Sean's career bridges advanced research, entrepreneurship, and venture capital. He co-founded Expanse, which was acquired by Palo Alto Networks for $1 billion, and he's a cybersecurity pioneer that's mapped global internet attack surfaces. It even conducted hypersonic defense research at DARPA. At Sequoia, Sean has led investments in groundbreaking companies like SpaceX, The Boring Company, Mach Industries, XAI, and Descartes. Thank you so much, Sean, for joining us today. How are you?
Thrilled to be here. Thanks everyone for joining.
Well, Sean,
And I gotta say, Georgetown is a pretty good school. You guys did all right, but you better live up to it.
well, hopefully we do. Well, Sean, I'd like to start learning a little bit about where your passion for technology was ignited. And I know it started when you were 7 years old and you built a computer out of scrap metal with your cousin over Thanksgiving. Could you elaborate a little bit on why you were first interested in computer science and how those experiences shaped your love for tech and your approach as an investor today?
You're gonna make me look too good. Look, I'm naturally curious, and so that's something that I don't think you can fake, and it's something that some people are born with. I think most of you all probably were born with that too. My curiosity was pretty obsessive though, and would lead to things like, I mean, I think probably the best example was later on in life when I was about 13. I kind of I couldn't do any special relativity calculations, but I started thinking about special relativity thought experiments. And there was one like thought experiment where I literally couldn't sleep for many months trying to understand this. And I wasn't able to understand it until I was about 18 when I could actually do the calculations. And basically that thought experiment was, imagine you have, like we're told in special relativity that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. And so imagine you have three rocket ships and they're all oriented in a line, like A, B, and C or whatever. And B is in the middle, A is flying away from B at close to the speed of light, and C is flying away from B at close to the speed of light. Special relativity tells you that A and C are also flying away from each other at, less than or equal to the speed of light. And I just intuitively could not possibly understand, like, how can you have three rocket ships in a line where it's like close to the speed of light in these directions, but then from the center one, but those other two are also going away at less than or equal to the speed of light. I just could not understand it, would think about it every night. And kind of eventually, maybe 4 or 5 years later, really understood it, which the answer to this is that space is not flat. And the idea of having rocket ships in a line is just not possible in space. Like space is heavily curved when you go into like relativistic speeds. And basically space goes from, our intuition is it's like flat sheets of space. And those sheets become saddles as you get to more and more relativistic speeds or higher speeds close to the speed of light. And when you go to the saddle, basically in some higher dimensional, like in an embedding geometry, and there's a point to why I'm going into this full thing, but basically when you go into some embedding geometry and you put like each of these sheets in that embedding geometry, like as you go to the limit of speed of light for each of these three things, the rocket ships actually form an equilateral triangle in terms of like their orientation of where they are in this higher dimensional embedding space. And like, I'm giving this as an example because this is what I've been like on every single thing my entire life. Like I just, when I get interested in some topic, I literally can't sleep. And that happened, the first like technical project where that happened was computers. And I had a cousin that was a computer science major at UCLA, and he came home for Thanksgiving And UCLA was giving away a bunch of old computer parts, and he basically filled up a car and brought them to our house. And he helped me set up most of the first computer. And like they were old parts that didn't all work. So you had to mix and match. He had a bunch of extra parts. And but like we didn't get the computer fully set up while he was there. And so I had to, as a 7-year-old, figure out how to like actually get everything working and install DOS. And um, many of you probably don't even know what MS-DOS was, but that was my first operating system. And look, I was obsessed with it for days and I couldn't sleep. And then once I had the computer, it was the only thing around me that really captivated me. And I just was on the computer nonstop. So anyways, I'm sorry for the really long monologue, but you can't fake extreme curiosity. And but there are things you can do to nurture it. And the last thing I'll say on this is one thing that I have done well is to I've been willing to follow my own instincts with my curiosity. And this has oftentimes had great short-term cost. Like, for example, in high school, instead of going to school, like I was just insanely bored in school. And I was at a point where I was doing like pretty serious stuff on computers, hacking and like basic programming and networking and like building websites for people and even getting paid sometimes for building websites or building computers for people. And I basically made a conscious decision of instead of going to school where I would spend like 1 hour in math class and 1 hour in English class and 1 hour in another and have the context switching, you don't really learn when you're having to switch fields every hour. I basically decided to stay home and do my own projects, even though that meant getting an F in algebra 2. And, like by all intents and purposes, like forced me down a non-traditional path. Like I was willing to make the bet early on that I would figure it out down a non-traditional path. But by being willing to bet on that, it let me actually learn real skills deeply. Because it's hard to learn things when you're context switching all the time or when you're following what you're told rather than following your own passions and curiosity. So sorry for the monologue. Next question.
Well, curious, your background in quantum computing and your academic journey eventually led you to getting recruited to work at DARPA.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, how is the change from being deployed in Afghanistan, being deployed in Afghanistan from that of getting your PhD at Caltech and working in a different country on the complete other side of the world?
Um, so, and as a meta point, so when I worked at DARPA, I lived in Foggy Bottom, very close to where you all are. And every weekend I would walk up from Foggy Bottom to Georgetown and I would go to the Barnes and Noble. I don't think it's still there anymore, but I would go to the Georgetown Barnes and Noble and just read books for like 4 or 5 hours usually every Saturday. That was my routine. So, anyways, and then I'd walk around the Georgetown campus, which is a very beautiful place. So I have a time, that's my proximity to Georgetown. One other Georgetown proximity, my brother-in-law is a guy named John Neiman. John started Sweetgreen, co-founded Sweetgreen with two amazing guys, Nate Rue and Nick Jamay. They were all Georgetown undergrads. And so John, the CEO of Sweetgreen, is my brother-in-law. So got another M Street, history. But look, working at working at DARPA was an incredible point in my life. We did pretty crazy work, and it like part of why I was recruited is because I had shown earlier on in my life that I was willing to take big risks and that um I'm good at going from one crazy environment to another. Like before I worked at DARPA, I had already backpacked around the world. I'd been to probably 70 countries or something at that point. I've now been to over 100 countries. Um, and I had like pretty broad technical interests and I had actually done real projects. And so like even while I was at Caltech before DARPA, I started a company. That company failed. It was a space launch company. Um, Wild failure, but learned an incredible amount along the way. And honestly, I underestimated SpaceX back then. This was like 2009 is when we really started it. And SpaceX was a very different company than today. I don't know, like there's not much more for me to say. I think it's the same thing as the curiosity question. Like my whole life, I've been willing to do things in a different way, which has forced me to be able to handle adversity. Like, and to give you an example, because I had a 1.8 GPA in high school and an F in algebra 2 and all of that, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get into a good college, the normal path. And so I used like my hacker perspective, and I realized that there's this thing called the California High School Proficiency Exam. It's basically a GED equivalency in California. And I realized that I'd done pretty well on the SAT. And I realized that if I leave high school early and go to community college for 2 years, it's very embarrassing and a big ego blow. But if I go get good grades there combined with good SATs, I'll be able to get into college. Um, and so I did that. But this experience of like, let me tell you, like leaving high school early and going to community college, like that was very embarrassing for me. And um, but it's also good training for things like going to Afghanistan. As crazy as that sounds, like whenever you've had to deal with, going into new environments, whatever they are, there's pattern matching to it.
And curious, I mean, the pattern matching you identified while you were overseas, how has that changed your view generally of defense tech? I'm sure it's changed that immensely. And then just as an investor in technology.
I mean, look, the your late teens and early 20s are the most formative part of your life. And so to spend a few years working on like an Afghanistan project and a few months there in theater, it changed everything in my life. And like from there, I started a defense tech company in 2012. This was a very, there weren't many defense tech companies at the time. There were legacy primes and there were DC metro area, like kind of contracting shops, but there weren't people trying to build like new technology products. Like really the only company before us was Palantir, which is a just an unbelievable company. Palantir and Andrew are both incredible companies that I admire. But it was a very small community, and like it just having been to war, seeing all of that, it one of the things that it puts in you is like I wanted our warfighters to have the best technologies, the best capabilities, wanted to hopefully save lives on both sides. And I don't only mean of Americans. Something that I care a lot about in all wars, and this may be ironic because of like my very, very strong pro-Israel statements, but in any war, I think it's very important to minimize all civilian casualties and as much as possible. But war can simultaneously sometimes be necessary. And so, anyways, with that lens, wanted to build great technology that would help in war. And I'll make one other Georgetown connection, which is the people that led our seed round at Expanse was Trey Stevens from Founders Fund, who's a Georgetown alum, Andrew, co-founder, and Peter Thiel. It's not a Georgetown alum, but I don't know. That's like I guess the for actionable advice for people here, the times when you actually learn is when you're willing to go into the fire, like or when you're willing to really like take a risk. It's you have to be a little bit uncomfortable to actually learn. And so like the rate at which I was learning when I was in Afghanistan was 10x the rate when I was not in Afghanistan. And so 3 months was like 3 years worth of learning roughly. Um, and to all of you, like in your 20s, I think it's very important to take, do things that will truly maximize your learning, which means you have to go be uncomfortable. Um, so, and then you get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
By the way, Trey Stevens was one of our first guests, our first year.
Trey's a legend. Great guy.
Amazing human being. And thank you for that advice. Um, Want to shift it a little bit to more of a current events question. And it's widely known that you have a very close relationship with Elon Musk. And I'm curious, how did you initially become close with Musk? And how has your relationship with him and seeing his work ethic influenced you as an investor and what you look for in early stage founders?
I mean, look, I wouldn't say I'm really close with Elon, but I know Elon and I've worked with Elon, and I think unbelievably highly of Elon. And I think Elon is a very deeply misunderstood person. I would even go so far to say that I think he's a deeply underappreciated person. Um, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But look, just from the little bit of being around Elon that I have been, I've learned an incredible amount. Um, you know, one thing is I think Elon is probably the best identifier of talent in the world. And there's many examples of this. One example is one of the most important people at SpaceX. His name is Mark Juncosa. He's one of the top engineers, if not the top engineer in the company. He runs Starship today. Um, I may have the details 10% wrong. This may be a little bit urban legend, but I think this is fully accurate. So basically, Mark went to Cornell undergrad. He was, I believe, an economics major, but he was really into building race cars. He was on the Formula SAE team, and he basically would build race cars and drive them. He actually like broke his spine or something crashing one of these hobbyist cars. But he had an interview at SpaceX in the very early days, and I believe it was for a business role. Um, but then in one of his final meetings with Elon, Elon basically realized that he's an incredible engineer, even though he was an economics major and wasn't even interviewing for like a mechanical engineering job. And you know, the urban legend, but I think there's a lot of truth in this, is like Elon basically said, instead of being a business guy, you're going to be a mechanical engineer. And Mark went on, over more than 15 years to like basically run engineering in the company. And I can't think of another founder that would think so much from first principles that they're interviewing someone for a different job and they'll be able to identify this person's actually an engineering genius, even though they have nothing like really obvious about that on paper, and to put them into like an engineering job where they then go on to basically run engineering in the company. Another example is this guy, Steve Davis, who Steve is another genius. Um, Steve was very early at SpaceX, like roughly employee number 20. Um, he met Elon at like a Stanford aerospace engineering talk that Elon was giving. I I don't know this part, but I would guess Steve stood out because he's a genius and he probably asked a smart question or something. But he joined SpaceX early on. He was head of guidance, navigation, control. Later on, when SpaceX needed to do more stuff in DC, Elon basically told Steve to open a DC office. And so even though Steve didn't know that much about it, like he moved to DC, opened a DC office. Um, while he was in DC, he started, you guys are too young for this, but he started a frozen yogurt store called Mr. Yogato. It used to be by far the best yogurt store in DC. Um, that had like you could get discounts if you could answer trivia questions or wear a costume. It was very quirky. But Steve also got a PhD at George Mason, like on the side while he was there. And then when Elon decided to do the Boring Company, he basically told Steve to figure it out. And Steve, runs the Boring Company. But this ability, like probably the number one thing I've learned from being around Elon is he's willing to give rope to young people, like to really young people, if they prove like step one is if they're willing to say yes to some challenging job or task. And it's okay to say no, but like he's willing, if someone is really talented and they say they can do something, he'll let them do it, even though it would never be like like you should never, from just the person's resume or background, give them that job or opportunity or responsibility. Um, and what happens is either people succeed, and if they succeed, they move up a lot and very quickly in its companies, or if they fail, then they're basically out of the company. And that that is what lets the absolute most talented people rise up. And it's one of the things that helps keep some of the most talented people in the world just like deeply kind of loyal and and like empowered in these orgs. And it also gives Elon a lot of leverage because he's over 20 years accumulated this kind of team of a couple dozen of the most talented people in the world that have kind of risen up and passed through the filters over, over many years. So, and then I'll just say one other thing, which something that I think Elon does unbelievably well is just setting the vision of his companies. And this may sound simple or not very important, but like if you go look at the actual mission statements of his companies, they are they they basically, the mission statements themselves set the culture of the company and also like give they filter out people. Like, for example, with the mission statement, I don't remember the exact one. Let me pull up the SpaceX one second. The SpaceX mission statement is to revolutionize space technology and enable people. Sorry, what it's trying to find. I mean, right now on the website says making humanity multiplanetary. And one of the things that comes, and that may not be the exact mission statement, but it's close to it. By putting in multiplanetary, you're filtering out people that don't have that ambition and don't want to work on Mars, to be explicit. And there's actually like I would say most people, probably 90% of humans, like don't want to work on something related to Mars. They think that it's too crazy, too far out, and maybe less so now than 20 years ago. But by having the right mission statements, it selects the right people for the company, and it gives people clarity. So that even if Elon is, working on Tesla or something else, like people know what they're working towards. And I really I cannot overstate, I think, how important just the vision setting of Elon is in all of his companies.
Makes a ton of sense. But clearly you saw something early, specifically in SpaceX, as when you brought it to Sequoia, as a potential investment. It was met with some excitement, but also a ton of skepticism among your investment committee. And I'm curious, you ended up convincing the skeptics and in doing a $20 million round in 2019, and then leading their $2 billion.
We then invested 600 million in summer of 2020.
Curious why there was so much skepticism initially in the investment, but then also second, how voting on investments works at Sequoia and how you were able to convince kind of the rest of the IC.
There is, I mean, look, there's always a lot of asymmetry of information in investing, and the best investments are the ones that are contrarian and right. SpaceX was quite contrarian in 2019 and 2020 because this was before Starlink. And the logic of most investors, like people that were not that close to the company, was SpaceX, for the 17 years prior in its company, the company had been focused on launch and only launch. And the launch market is not very big. It's roughly $7 billion a year, something like that. And it depends if you count China or not, but call it, I think, being maximally generous, there's probably about 7 billion of launch revenue that was addressable by SpaceX back then. And, the profit margin of the company for launch, I think at the time, like it was hard for people to imagine that it'd be more than, say, 30%. And so that's like about 2 billion of profit that the company could have if it had 100% theoretical, penetration of the launch market opportunity. And they're raising it a $36 billion valuation. And so, to invest at 18x the maximum profit margin, or like assuming launch market stayed the same size, Like that seems insane. And that I know it may seem today like that's really failed, sloppy thinking, but first of all, SpaceX is just in a very different place today than it was 5, 6 years ago. At the time they're doing about 10 launches a year. Now they're doing, 150 this year, roughly. This is before Starship was working at all, and it was before Starlink was working at all. And so the conventional wisdom at the time was launch market had been basically the same size as a market for 20 plus years before that. And so it's like, it's not a market that's going to grow. That was the perspective. Um, and for Starlink, most people thought it would fail. Um, there had been a history of failed space internet constellations. The most famous was probably Iridium's constellation in the like 90s and early 2000s. Um, and then, OneWeb is not a particularly great business. And so there was this deep skepticism that Starlink will work. And it wasn't really on people's radar at the time. But for me, I got very lucky, to be honest. And like a lot of times in life, you have to acknowledge when you're lucky. Um, and look, half of it was having a prepared mind because I had started a failed space launch company and I knew a lot of physics and, all of that. But I had some friends that one friend that was already an investor in SpaceX and a bunch of friends that were engineers at the company. And in 2019, they got really excited about Starlink. And I was just lucky. I had friends involved with the company and they really felt like Starlink was going to work. And so if you believe that Starlink's going to work, you have to think about the company very differently. Instead of it, being you're investing at 18x the theoretical profit limit, fixed broadband internet's about $1 trillion a year market. Mobile data is about $1 trillion a year market. At SpaceX, I think there's call it 20% of each of those markets where they have a really unfair advantage. I mean, and in a lot of situations, like in rural settings or hiking, there's literally no alternative, or a lot of military applications, etc. So there's probably like 400, 500 billion a year revenue opportunity where Starlink has there is no alternative, and it basically forces people to partner with them. Um, and so, anyways, I understood that, and it took a while for the evidence to come in. And so, what happened? The reason why we did a big investment in summer of 2020 is because we were able to actually use Starlink. So we were some of the first people to get a demo, and it initially only worked in Redmond, Washington. And this was during the depths of COVID. This was like July 2020. So myself and I brought one of my partners, Andrew Reed. We flew up to Redmond, Washington, which was the only place where you could do the Starlink demo at the time. And we FaceTime videoed a bunch of our partners. And at that point, it's like, okay, this is going to work. It's going to be really big. And we did a really big check at that point. And then we invested a bunch more after that too. So anyways, you asked the question. I'm giving you the full answer, but I think the last thing I'll say is like it may be easy to be sitting in a chair right now and think like, oh, that doesn't sound that non-obvious or whatever. Like it was pretty non-obvious at the time. And I just I think a healthy way to go through life, especially as an investor, is to ask like, you know, if I could change one thing about this company, like what would it be worth, or how valuable would it be? And then to think about, for the ones where it'd be 100x more valuable, think like, what is the probability that that thing changes? Or can I have any influence on changing that thing? And I didn't have any influence on making Starlink work, but I understood that there was a high chance that it would work. And I think a lot of the best investments kind of fit this pattern where there's maybe like one thing that's not yet working, or one thing that's going to change, or one thing you have to dream on. Um, and I would encourage people to try to view the world that way.
Well, want to focus on on Starlink for a second. And they've launched over 5,000 satellites, if I have it right.
Yep.
And like today, multiple private companies such as Astronis, right, are racing to deploy their own mega constellations. And it seems for the first time, private companies, not governments, are becoming the dominant actors in low Earth orbit. And I guess my question is how should space traffic management and regulatory oversight evolve? Uh, and is the answer to still have the FAA and FCC doing it, or do we need someone new?
One of the things that Elon's been talking a lot about in the context of Doge is that there's like we add new laws all the time, but there hasn't really been a way to remove laws or regulation. And like obviously regulation is very important in many domains and safety is incredibly important. So I don't I don't think you need any different department than FAA or FCC. Like I think they both serve very, very important jobs. But I think there has to be within those departments ways to one, like remove some of the old laws or regulations that are no longer relevant, and two, adapt to change. Like the FAA was designed for airplanes, not for rockets, and especially not for a rocket that's going to fly, you know, hundreds of times a year. Um, and so like with if I'm being really honest, I think that the FAA in the last administration was political against Elon. And like I don't think any government whoever's in charge, I don't think government regulatory bodies should ever be like politically motivated against people. Um, but I also think that they were understaffed and under-equipped for this change, which is like very high cadence launch. And so anyways, I think both are true. And I think that we need better ways to deregulate, which is something that, the Trump administration is like pursuing pretty heavily. So I don't know. Nuanced answer. I think you can do all this within the FAA and FCC. I think we probably have the right institutions, but I think they kind of need to change how they operate.
Interesting. Well, I want to bring this also to Sequoia's portfolio and kind of your relationship with founders a little bit more. And um, you have an unwavering support for founders like Patrick Collison, Stripe, like Elon Musk, or Samir. Um, it's all really well known. And I'm curious, those founders have come back and supported you joining Sequoia. I know there's the famous story of Patrick. Um, what drives your commitment to the entrepreneurs you back, and how does your approach differ from other VCs? Because it fundamentally seems that they're supporting you much more than they're supporting other VCs.
Um, Look, I've made I've made lots of mistakes as a VC, but I've also made lots of mistakes in life. As I said, I have a failed space launch company that I started. I've also started a successful company, and so I'm starting from a place of like a lot of founder empathy, and that's just like a strong advantage as a VC, and it deeply shapes how I like act as a VC. That said, like I can think of a few, and I do think I'm one of the most loyal VCs out there to my founders, but there have been a few instances where I didn't fully side with founders that I regret. So I will just call that out. And like one actually was with Samir, who for the most part I've supported very, very deeply. But a lesson for me is I do think that as VC, like you should basically always support the founders you work with. Um, and something that maybe seem counterintuitive or a contradiction, but I actually think that that can still include being involved in firing founders sometimes. There's one situation where like I was on the board of a company called IonQ, which is a public quantum computing company now. And we had a early CEO who he's an incredible guy and it was incredibly talented. But he didn't have much operating experience. Like he had basically been in academia and a little bit in the government. and he did an unbelievable job running the company in the early days. But after a couple of years, like he wasn't the right guy for the next stage of the company, and I think he knew that himself. And I was involved in helping him transition. It's like a nice euphemism, like out of the CEO job. But it was done like even when you're involved in that, like this was done with an unbelievable amount of love and respect. And we had dinner that night. Like there were a few hours of pain, but like we had dinner that night, we had drinks, we were laughing, like, you know, still respect him a ton. So I think there's this as a VC, it's important to do your fiduciary duty, which is like trying to maximize shareholder value. It's also important to have founder empathy and like not kick founders when they're down, and to really try to give them the benefit of the doubt. And then it's also important when like hard things need to happen to try to do them in the best way possible, where, like even if you're involved in like changing a CEO, to have it really be done in such a fair above board way that people would like still give you a good reference and want to work with you again. It's not always possible to do that. Um, but anyways, it's being a VC is a tougher job than people would think. Um, and one aspect of it is you're basically a therapist. Like that is like one of the core job functions is being a therapist. And that involves dealing with a lot of egos, co-founder issues, executive issues, kind of being someone, the famous founding of Silicon Valley was basically the founding of started with Shockley Semiconductor, which is the first silicon transistor company. And, famously the Traders Eight were eight of the early employees that left. And there's a bunch of like not very well understood history of what happened, but basically Shockley was actually not an independent company. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of another company called Beckman Instruments. Arnold Beckman was a Caltech professor who had been a mentor to Shockley when he was an undergrad, and they started the company together. And basically Beckman was on the board. I think he was chairman of the board of Shockley Semiconductor. And the Traders Eight, before they left, they went to Beckman and like asked him what to do. And my understanding of what Beckman said to them was basically like, look, guys, I helped Shockley start this company. Like, I know he's a bad manager. I know he's hard to work with. Like, but I have to be loyal to him because, I started the company with him and we're friends. And so like you have my blessing to leave the company. And they all obviously left and then started Fairchild, and then Intel spun out of that, and kind of the whole silicon industry. But that job that Beckman did there of like this stuff happens all the time. And it's just a fine line of balancing all the egos and like fairness and all these things. And it's also you can't anticipate when these things will come up. Like they come up in the middle of the night all the time. You get a phone call that someone is suing you, or suing a company you work with, or a journalist is trying to hit piece, or like you have a fire in your physical manufacturing facility, or just like things are happening all the time. And kind of my job is a lot after making an investment decision, it's being like a therapist, an ego manager, and a firefighter.
Interesting. Um, well, I want to ask you about, you're very much and very openly a strong supporter of Israel. Um, and given your kind of experience, passion, for the Israeli market, I'm curious, what have you found unique about Israel's startup system, Tel Aviv's as well? Um, and how does it differ from really any other tech market?
Good question. I would say there's two fundamental differences, that I think really work in the favor of the Israeli ecosystem. One is the army, like, mandatory service, which does a bunch of things, but, one is it filters out the best people. And let me go back. Like one of the most important things to building big companies, universally true anywhere, is concentrating a lot of talent into the same companies. It's like when you're making wine, the the best wine usually comes from seasons where like there was some adversity, and so a bunch of grapes didn't make it, and sugars get concentrated, into like the surviving grapes, and you get like very high. And anyways, um, and I'm not a wine expert at all, so I may be botching some of that metaphor, but like part of the success of Google was the dot-com crash happened. They were a winning company. They had capital, and they were able to go hire all the smartest people from companies that were failing in the dot-com crash. And so they were able to concentrate early on, just so many outlier talents. And this is just almost every great company concentrated huge amounts of talent early on. Even when I mentioned Shockley, like, the traders ate left. They had those people then went on to start basically the entire silicon industry. In Israel, the army really helps to concentrate talent because what happens is people rise to the top in the army, and like who are the people that did the absolute most impressive things, and that's kind of a known quantity. And people then want to go work for those people or with those people later on. Um, like to use an analogy of, say, Stanford University, there's nothing at Stanford at that same age range of like 18 to 22 that really shows like who are the absolute best people in the class. And it's like, maybe within the CS department who some of the highest IQ CS people are, but then how do you compare them to the physics kids or the math kids or the electrical engineering kids or the business kids or, and there's what happens is like everyone wants to start their own company, and, they kind of have an ego about it. And so everyone goes and starts their own company. In Israel, kind of the people that really rise to the top in the army, they concentrate talent in a really, really insane and incredible way. Um, and I think that's just like a core property for building great companies. It's like the army itself lets you concentrate talent, and that's into specific companies. And then the second thing that I think is really different is or important is, look, I think the probably the most important trait for building legendary companies is just sheer grit. Sometimes that manifests as like a chip on your shoulder. Um, like at Sequoia, a lot of our best founders in history were immigrants or children of immigrants, which that oftentimes like puts a chip on your shoulder, like self-selects for people that have a lot of grit. It's not easy, you know, to leave wherever you're from, start over, and oftentimes you're bullied as a kid for being different, all these things. And basically in Israel, it's like an entire country of people that have a chip on their shoulder. It's an entire country of people that feel misunderstood, um, like feel like their success is existential. If Israel doesn't produce technologies that are just absolutely best in the world and needed, then no one's going to buy their stuff. Like people don't want to buy Israeli products. So your product needs to be twice as good as someone else's. And if they don't keep producing amazing things, like, and the economy stops, like it's existential for the company, for the country. Like people will literally die. Um, and so just that, it's like an entire country with a chip on its shoulder and this extra grit that gives a rational motivation. And so those two things together of concentrating talent, like the army basically takes away a lot of people's ego and shows who the best people are and allows you to concentrate talent, and an entire country of people with chip on their shoulder is just a really strong recipe for building startups.
Let me strike into that a bit. And I'm curious, the IDF's Unit 81, highly classified technical unit within the military, um, but it has gained a reputation as being a vanguard of kind of Israel's startup industry. I think like you had over 100 Unit 81 alumni start 50 startups, raise billions between those. Um, I'm curious, have you ever interacted with that talent base? Why do you think that talent base specifically within the Israeli military breeds such strong talent?
I mean, when you say something like highly classified, my instinct is I probably shouldn't talk about it. Um, but like, yes, I've definitely worked with people from Unit 81, and they have a lot of really, really incredible people. Um, and I would just say like in Israel, there's courses, and then there's also like the unit you serve in. Courses, so there's things like Talpiot and Aram are two examples of where they select, you know, at different ages, but for the most part at 18, it's like the smartest kids. And so in Aram, it's basically the best hackers in the country. And in Talpiot, it's people that have like extreme aptitude in physics in particular, but also leadership abilities and athletic abilities. And so in each of these, like in Talpiot, you go and do a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, maybe even two bachelor's degree, like and a master's degree in basically math, physics, and CS in a few years, and then you do your service concurrently with that. And I think Talpiot's like a 7-year commitment. ROM is you don't get a degree, but you get special training in hacking, and then you go work. And basically, this selection process of like from the very beginning, finding in Talpio, call it 50 kids per year, and in Aram, less than that, finding just like the absolute smartest kids in the country and that have aptitude in a specific area and putting them into that, like around the way you really learn a lot is from peers that are talented like you, and have similar interests. And so concentrating these people um, into these courses, and then people going into specific units with other people, that are the most elite units that have the like people that have similar skills and talent, and you all learn from each other and you become competitive with each other and all this, like it really gets the best out of people. And I tried to not fully answer your question just because of how you framed it.
No, totally get it. Um, I'll reframe it differently next time. Um, Curious, and also kind of the evolving geopolitical landscape marked by conflicts, maybe near ending in the Ukraine and as well in Gaza, um, has brought certain defense vulnerabilities to the forefront. And curious, from your perspective, what are one or two of the most critical technology gaps these conflicts have highlighted? And how are you directing investment or resources towards companies that are innovating to address said gaps?
Good question. Um, I mean, look, the biggest gap in the West by far is just our manufacturing capacity. Like almost all the global manufacturing capacity has concentrated in Asia in the last 20 years. And that's just this, I'm not saying anything not obvious. This has been obvious to me. I've been saying this for a decade. So, I was saying this before it was obvious, but um, like I am less concerned about our ability to have state-of-the-art technology. I'm concerned around our ability to make lots of these things. And when you look in Ukraine, we just been wildly outproduced in everything. And I think that would be a much bigger issue if we were in a direct conflict with China in particular. And so, anyways, like rebuilding the supply chain is a core focus, not just of myself, but of I would say basically anyone that works in defense tech. Um, my personal philosophy on that is I think it's very hard to rebuild the supply chain. There's two things that are very hard. It's very hard to rebuild the supply chain if you try to directly intersect like a technology that's already on an exponential trend. I think you basically need to go to newer technologies. Like, for example, I think it would be very hard for us to catch up to catch up in like leading edge silicon fabrication by going head on against, say, TSMC or China. More like, and obviously TSMC is a Taiwanese company, but China's already for a decade invested a giant amount into their own, kind of fabrication capabilities. And I think they're sadly far ahead of us. Or another example would be in solar production. Like just China has gotten so incredibly good at making cheap and scaled solar, like photovoltaics. But I think there are other areas where we could intersect that in technologies that are incredibly important, where it's like not yet, the race isn't yet won. For example, instead of starting with leading edge silicon electronics, um, we're in a very early environment of silicon photonics. So instead of, electrons moving in a chip, like you etch out cavities where light moves in the chip. And um, silicon photonics is something that we've been talking about for 40 years. And it's only in the last few years that silicon photonics is like really, really starting to have an impact. And especially in like data center network switching, um, and then kind of data movement more broadly. And then now the next thing with silicon photonics is going to be sensing, like almost the limiting factor in almost any military application or any technology is usually sensors. Sensors, in my opinion, are one of the most underappreciated like technology areas in the world. If you look at a company like Honeywell, or Raytheon, those companies are basically sensor companies. Um, if you want a plane to fly well, the performance is usually limited by its like your sensing abilities. Like the performance of a missile is usually limited by your sensing abilities. Um, a lot of sensors are going to become silicon photonics over the next like 15 years or so. And we're very early in silicon photonics. And it's like the fabs are not very sophisticated and it's not that hard or as capital intensive to build like a state-of-the-art photonics fab. And so like we have to intersect these next generation technologies and get on the exponential curve there. This is something where like SpaceX has done an incredible job. They're the world leader in space launch. Tesla has done an unbelievable job in automotive production. Um, so anyways, my two philosophies, or I would say by far the most important thing for the West, from a defense tech perspective, is bringing back manufacturing. My philosophy of how to do it is, one, you need to intersect kind of like technologies that are not already fully on the exponential trend where you can intersect the future. And the second is, I think it's really you don't build the supply chains top down, you have to build them bottoms up, meaning that it's like a winning company will build its own supply chain. So like Tesla has basically built its own supply chain. They make their own batteries, they are now doing like, mineral refining, like everything. And once one company is a winning company that starts doing everything in their own supply chain, other companies benefit from that. Tesla will make surplus batteries and other companies will be able to sell them. Will have surplus launch capacity. Other people will be able to use it. They're making ion thrusters, and the teams of people that know how to do that will be able to go make ion thrusters for other people, like on and on and on. And so I rather than investing in like direct supply chain companies, I think you have to invest in companies that will have winning products and then will build their own supply chains for it. And so I don't know, those are my core philosophies there. And I've made quite a few investments behind those philosophies. And then I think the last thing I would say is, with all that in mind, I think the specific technology that we have to win that's at risk right now are drones. And I think especially like short range, very high attrition rate drones. So today, these are primarily FPV drones, first person view drones, which have been just insanely successful and important in Ukraine. Like America right now is very far behind in FPV drones. I invested in a company called Neros that is very exceptional there. But I think that like when you have long range drones, it's not as important because you don't need as many of them because you're not destroying them all the time. Um, it's really these FPV drones which will someday become autonomous, so they won't be FPV. But um, like if we were to go into war tomorrow with China, like that's probably the area where I'm most nervous.
Well, let me dive into that a little bit. And curious, like class one, under 30, 40 pound drones, so Neros is just killing it. Um, in curious, what did you see in Soren and Olaf
Yeah.
so early? And why do you think they've been able to reshape the class one drone market so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky to work with these guys. So there are a few things. One is I think there were very few people in America that actually understood the drone supply chain. Um, and so there were very few people that understood the drone supply chain. So these founders were unusual in that they're young guys. They're still in their very early 20s, but they had been professional drone racers in their teenage years. Soren, so there's two primary professional drone racing leagues. One is Drone Racing League, which is like the NASCAR equivalent, where people use the same drones, and so it's more about your piloting skills than your building skills. The other one is called Multi GP. This is more like F1, where you actually build your own drones, and so a lot of it is your engineering skill. Um, so Soren was the world champion in multi GP, and he was also a professional drone racer in Drone Racing League, like one of the people on the actual circuit on TV and all of that. But while doing that, Soren, and then with Olaf's help, started a global parts marketplace for people that were obsessed with drones. And so he did this in high school, and he got the thing to like non-trivial revenue scale. And so for anyone that was like a serious drone hobbyist or hacker or builder or racer, whenever you needed parts for your thing, like especially hard to source parts out of China, Soren's marketplace kind of had all these things on there. And so in that process, he really learned how the supply chain worked, which I think was just like essential skill. Um, he also showed just like early entrepreneurial kind of interest, which I think is also very important. I think it's usually the wrong idea to start a company just for the sake of starting a company. I think it's almost every successful company came from someone being like finding a real problem that just showed up in their life in some way and then starting the company to kind of address that problem. But I think it's also important just to have an entrepreneurial bent. So you had the entrepreneurial bent. They also just showed this like insane competitive, you know, edge in their drone racing skills. The next thing was kind of the first time I met Soren, I tried to invest, but he wouldn't take my money yet. It was right when he started the company, and he was actually going to go to Ukraine, like without any support, without any real connections. He just cared a lot about the war in Ukraine and felt like he's going to just go to Ukraine, as call it a 20-year-old kid, and this is in the early days of the war, and just see how he can help as a someone that's like was a world-class drone pilot. And that kind of fearlessness and willingness to take a risk like that was very, very high signal for me. And then in that process of like actually going to Ukraine, he's been a bunch of times, um, like he learned what the real gaps are and like what actually works, what doesn't work, what's needed, what is the real state of electronic warfare right now. Um, and by actually going and like training people to improve their piloting skills and seeing the state of the art, it let them from the beginning of Neros basically build the right thing. Um, and then just like the level of intensity that they've kind of come to bear has been extreme. And then I'll say one last thing, which is I think almost every great defense tech company, like a prerequisite for the founders is for them to be like die-hard, hardcore American patriots. Like I mean this in a serious
Oh, my
way.
lucky.
Like you have to be like a real really believe in America. Um, like if you look at the Anduril founders, they're maximum, American believers, the Palantir founders, Saronic founders, like basically everyone. Can't only myself as well. And this is, we didn't talk about it, but a lot of people in my family were in the military, and like I went to the 60th anniversary of D-Day with my dad because my dad and so both of my grandfathers were in the military. Two of my dads, one of his brothers-in-law, um, like my dad's dad and all three of his brothers all fought in World War II. Like one was killed on Omaha Beach a few days after D-Day. He's buried in American National Cemetery. Like I grew up, my grandpa and I used to ride our bikes through Camp Pendleton all the time. My dad's brother ran Walter Reed Hospital in DC. He was a captain in the Navy, so like a '06 in the Navy. And I grew up literally, my cousins like lived at Walter Reed or Bethesda Naval. It goes by both names. They lived on the base, and like I just really had this. And I think to start a successful defense tech company, you have to be like a hardcore American patriot. It just shows like customers, like with employees, with everything. I think if you come at it without that, it's just not going to work. And with Soren and Olaf, they're maximum, like, maximum patriots.
Helpful. Given, I mean, you're just speaking on the focus of kind of government, especially in this administration, especially in the last couple of months, there's been a widening or I guess more transparent convergence of Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., with the realms of AI and cryptocurrency and folks like David Sachs, Scott Kapoor, I guess most prominently, former venture capitalist JD Vance. Um, how do you see this increased VC engagement in politics reshaping the investment landscape or just tech generally?
Look, I think that it's really important. The founding principle of America, the First Amendment, is freedom of speech. And if if democracy will not work if people are not willing to speak up and willing to debate ideas and call out nonsense and all that. And I truly believe that we as a society, and especially tech, for like a 5-year period or maybe a little longer than that, people were not willing to talk to each other anymore. And I think idea like we got really sloppy in that period, and like a lot of bad ideas were able to pass as good ideas because people were canceled or silenced and afraid of speaking and all of that. And so to me, the biggest benefit of like the new environment we're in, and kind of having a bunch of tech people that kind of have joined the right, is I just think we're having much more of a conversation, and just civil discourse more broadly. I Sadly, I would say even in the last couple of weeks, I think we're kind of losing it again. Um, and I think both sides are to blame, but I just like it was not easy. I mean, I was one of the early people in Silicon Valley to come out support Trump this time around, and it was not easy. But we've gone to a point where you can now like actually debate things, and it's okay if you don't have to agree on every single topic. And we just cannot lose that. We lost it for 5 to 8 years. We can never lose it again. It is the most important thing. And I would just like I think on college campuses, the last the last 10, 20 years, it's been really hard to have alternative ideas, or be on the right or whatever. I would encourage anyone that's at Georgetown right now to really just like lean into learning from people you disagree with. Like just go debate people, listen to them, try to actually understand where they're coming from. And I think that for this tech people that are now in Washington, like that includes us. Like we should try to learn from and listen to people that disagree with us. Like, you can never have a monopoly of ideas.
Sean, I think a good place to end it is with something that's on your bio, on your page at Sequoia. And that is one of the ways you measure founders is by asking, what do they do on their weekends? What do you do on your weekends? And how do you think it relates to the work you're doing at Sequoia and your passion in investing?
It's changed for me a lot over time. I would not pass my own, filter anymore. But back in the day, I mean, like I spent my weekends learning like that. That's really how I spent my weekends. Like when I said I would go to the Barnes and Noble in Georgetown almost every Saturday, like I'm not joking. I would go every Saturday for many hours and just read books for free. Um, and I mean, as an investor, I think one of the top traits in successful founders is curiosity. Like when you look at Elon, Elon, like Peter Thiel, Patrick Collison, um, Dylan Field from Figma, they all have very different personalities in a lot of ways. And like but I think that by far the number one thing that they all have in common is just extreme curiosity, like extreme curiosity. Um, I think that extreme curiosity is basically a universal trait in all the best founders. I think a secondary, like less important one is like competitiveness. Um, you don't, it's not as important as curiosity, but it's still very important and pretty much a universal trait, even in the people that, you may not guess it from the outside. Um, and so like when you see you have to think about what are you looking for if you're hiring someone or investing in someone. It's like in the case of founders or investing, I think you need to like look for people that demonstrate extreme curiosity, extreme like grit and a competitive spirit in what they do. So like people that go do ultra marathons or like crazy hikes, like those things spike for grit and competitiveness. You know, reading obsessive a story from Patrick Collison that really I've always loved Patrick, but like the thing that really just I think shows who he is. One time I was at his house. This was a long time ago, roughly 2016, and he was leaving for a week. On like once a year, twice a year, he would go on a vacation alone, where he would bring a duffel bag of books, like an actual duffel bag of books, call it 20 plus books, to just go read. And he was going to Japan for a week alone just to read books. And like he showed me all the books he had. I have a photo somewhere of like the most random topics possible, and he was just so excited to go be alone and like walk around Japan for exercise and read books for 8 hours a day. And I just so it was obvious to me at that moment that this guy is going to be just unbelievably successful and will outlearn almost everyone. And one on Elon, this is from my partner Roelof Botha, but there was kind of a story when Roelof was the CFO at PayPal and part of the PayPal mafia. When Elon was starting SpaceX, I don't know whose bachelor party this was, but a bunch of people from PayPal mafia were in Vegas for someone's bachelor party, and like there's a story of Elon basically brought a bunch of rocket books with him. It's called 2001 or early 2002, and he was just by the pool reading like rocket books all day. Um, and just that's when you have a winner on your hands, at least as a founder, because they're going to outlearn everyone and they're going to figure stuff out and they're going to come up with new ideas and and integrate stuff. And so, anyways, you have to look for people where the hobbies match what you're trying to hire for.
Well, that's great advice, Sean. And I can't thank you enough for doing this. I know I learned a ton. I'm sure everybody watching learned a ton. And this will definitely be one of the highlights of this year's event.